Okay, today we're going to be concluding our initial study of spirals, looking at our spiral universe. And you may recall that I asked you at the end of the last class to think about what our ancestors, if anything, were trying to tell us when they left spiral designs and diagrams on the walls of caves or in ancient art or in prehistoric mounds or other structures that they built. For example, this is I don't know if you can see it, but it's a drawing from Newgrange, which is a large megalithic structure in the British Isles. And there are many spiralic designs like that. There are actually, of course, there are many variations, but typically they go like this, and then they have one here that goes like this. So they're like attached, like twin spirals. Anyway, what do you think they were trying to tell us, if anything, by these symbols? What did they represent? Any ideas?
That this plan is one manifestation of eternal spiral of life into infinity.
Into infinity. Okay. Do you want to explain that, just briefly? What does that mean?
That our world is infinite, and that we are infinite. We're created eternal.
Okay, we're created eternal. We come from where?
From the Creator.
From our Creator. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, okay, that's good. Balance, harmony, interconnectedness. Those are all key concepts, yes?
It may be simplistic, but I'm just feeling like they live so closely to nature and the world, and these forces we're seeing with your pendulum and seeing in nature.
Yeah.
Even when I get out of all the noise of our culture and get into nature, I feel that more than they lived in it and didn't have words to muck it up. The sense of that spiral energy was so innate in them that they would say, this is it. This is what it's happening.
Yeah, okay, that's another one. In fact, here's a photograph of twin spirals, galaxies. Of course, these are hard to see with your naked eye. But anyway, we live in a galaxy somewhat, we live in a spiral galaxy ourselves, something like this one here. Do you know where we are in that galaxy? Approximately? Are we more toward the center? More toward the periphery? Anybody know? We are in the suburbs. We're about 2/3 of the way out on one of those long spiral arms. So we're not in the sticks, so to speak, like here in Beckett, but more like Lee or Stockbridge. All right.
But when Newgrange was new, which was thousands of years ago, I think, what was the night sky like then? Maybe this, when you see the whole thing, it's covered in spirals and there's other sort of triangular patterns, so it's a whole, and it is clearly a sacred space. Everyone who's there is some sort of a sacred space. And maybe that is a representation of the universe, of the stars that they could actually see.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point too, that actually what we call the sky or heavens changes constantly, so that the night sky that we observe today is very different from the one that people 5,000, 10,000 years ago. In fact, in future classes we will look at some of those celestial cycles. In fact, there's a major cycle that takes about 25,000 years, and it has to do with the position of the constellations and the northern stars. It's a very basic cycle. All right, anyway, I think you're all on the right track here, that these spiral images in some ways mirror the universe in which we live. And all ancient cultures and societies had what we call creation myths to describe the origin of life, the origin of the cosmos. Today, in the modern world, we have also creation myths. And the major myth or story today about creation is what?
Big Bang.
It's called the Big Bang. And according to the Big Bang theory, universe began how? With a primal explosion from a central point, and then it exploded outward like this. And at that moment of explosion, the elements, beginning with hydrogen and then helium, were created. Actually, they become more sophisticated over the last half century, and so some of these, there are approximately 120 elements. So the current theory is that most of the elements, or many of the elements, were created through the primal explosion, but there is somewhat continuous creation now, particularly through the stars. When stars are formed, they also create elements through nuclear transmutation. Anyway, this is the major paradigm or model of creation today, called the Big Bang. And of course the question is, what, if anything, existed before the Big Bang? It's like, you know, a 5-year-old child, that would be their first question, like, what, you know, where did this come from? And modern scientists have no answer for this. But the reason that they come up with this model is that when they measure the light from the stars from billions of galaxies around the world, and they plot it on graphs or computers, everything converges at a point, and they actually have measured the time, and currently it's somewhere between 13 and 14 billion years ago, they say everything began. So what do you think of this model? Is this true? Is this a fable? Is this... Yeah. Yeah, of course there's kind of an ongoing debate in America particularly among different religious denominations and organizations who don't accept the theory of evolution, or you might say cosmic evolution leading to biological evolution. And they come up, their theory in contrast is called what? Creationism? You probably heard that term. Anyway, so they say, well, like in the Bible, it said God created the world and all the life forms and so forth. And that's their creation myth. And other religions also have stories of the beginning of humanity or the beginning of the cosmos. And so these are ridiculed to a great extent by modern scientists who say that there's no real evidence for any of this. In fact, all the empirical evidence through astronomy, physics, chemistry, and so forth leads to this conclusion.
I think that the challenge here is that we're asking a question inside of an already created system in which time and space come into existence. The Big Bang is that moment at which time is created and space is created. You can ask it, but it has no meaning in an infinite system.
Yeah.
But we could, and that makes it a challenge for my mind, my limited mind, to even deal with it. But it's not inconsistent with a spiraling universe. James Blish wrote 3 wonderful science fiction novels called Cities in Flight about this. This could be the spiral contracting all the way in, and then the explosion that brings it all the way out. And the other side of this theory is that there's a maximal expansion point at which it's going to spiral back in.
Okay. Anyway, that's an interesting creative interpretation. Yeah. Anyway, we'll be looking at this perhaps at the end of the class again to look at see how it conforms with some of our further studies. But I would say my initial reaction to this is that this is the modern creation myth, and that it developed in the mid-20th century, and in fact is a reflection, in my view, of modern times, and very specifically of what? What gave birth to this model? Primal explosion. Atomic energy. This is a myth of the atomic bomb. And it's no coincidence, in my view, that it arose in the beginning of the 1920s and was formulated very concretely in the 1940s, right after the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then the beginning of the Cold War. So this, in fact, I believe is a Cold War myth. And it reflects the modern worldview of the 20th century, which is a very violent, explosive view. And it's interesting today, like when you ask scientists, like what is the sun? And the common scientific view of the sun, for example, is they'll often say, well, it's this extremely hot body that is generated by constant thermonuclear explosions, right? You've heard that probably. So again, they project onto the sun and other celestial bodies, again, this human violent model of a weapon that is in constant motion. It's very interesting from a psychological point of view. All right, if we look now at more traditional creation story and alternative model of the universe and the origin of life, what we find is that in most societies and cultures, they talk about a creator or a god or a spirit or some ineffable, unnameable source of life that gave rise to manifestation, appearance. Now, the model that I'm going to present you, I think is kind of a combination of traditional models, and this was then developed, or you might say formalized by George Osawa and Michio Kushi and Macrobiotic teachings, again in the mid 20th century. In fact, you might say it's almost the same time that the Big Bang model came out. It's kind of the inverse of that. And it is a spiralic model in which we have 7 distinct phases or orbits of the spiral. And I'll go through with you the different stages here. Okay, now this spiral itself, you might say, is manifestation. So manifestation arises out of the unmanifest. In other words, you have to have a nothingness behind or out of which then something or manifestation arises. So there are many names for the world of the unmanifest. Sometimes it's called the absolute. In Western history, it's called God. In the Middle East, this is called Allah. In India, it's called Brahman. In China, it's called the Tao. In Buddhism, it's called Sunyata. Anyway, there are many, many names and concepts for this ultimate, unnameable, mysterious source of being. Okay. So in some ways you might say that's the 7th level. Okay, and then out of this mysterious ultimate reality, the first manifestation is what we call polarity. Okay, so we might label that as 6, as polarity. Now, polarity, what is polarity? Polarity means two-ness or poles. So no longer is there an ultimate oneness, but there's some kind of differentiation. And in our macrobiotic studies, the most fundamental differentiation is what we have studied as yin and yang, okay? And the relative tendency toward contraction or expansion. Now, traditionally in most cultures, this was called heaven and earth. Or yin and yang. Okay. So this is something like an energy field, you might say, because it's creating polarity, but there's still no manifestation, either material or spiritual. Between, it's just like a field of polarity that's still relatively invisible, but it can be felt. Okay? But then arising out of the world of polarity comes what? If you hold your hands, what do you feel? Okay, so polarity right and left, up and down, in and out, gives rise then to some kind of energy, or what we call vibration. So the world of energy and vibration is the next one. Okay. Now, as this, again, this universal spiral of motion and it continues to contract, that energy and vibration, as it condenses, becomes what? And the first stage of matter is what we call, atoms and then pre-atomic particles. Okay? And these pre-atomic particles, of which the best known, of course, are electrons, protons, neutrons, but even those can be broken down now into many, many other particles. So you have like quarks, which are supposed to be the ultimate particles, but even quarks can be broken down into many types of quarks. So constantly discovering smaller and smaller pre-atomic particles. Anyway, but as then these particles come together, as then the cosmos again continues to contract, these give rise to elements and compounds. Okay? So in fact, here, the Big Bang model, where hydrogen, helium, lithium, etc., come out, actually is this fifth stage of elements and compounds. Or you might say the mineral world. I'm sorry, 3. Elements and compounds are broadly, we can say, the mineral kingdom, though there's some gases there as well. And then as that continues to contract, condense, materialize, this gives rise to what? Good, what we call biological life or botanical life. So the vegetable kingdom is the second one. And then that is followed by the animal world or kingdom. And the apex, or the most recent species in the animal world, is what? Us. Mankind and womankind, right? So human. Okay, so human beings, we are at the center of this huge centripetal inward moving spiral of creation. This whole spiral can be called the spiral of materialization because it's moving inward. and it's manifesting more physical, more concrete, more material. But it starts out, again, from the unmanifest through vibrational to increasing complexity and density here. Okay? So this is a basic model that we use in macrobiotic philosophy. And of course the question comes up, well, is this an accurate model? Well, of course it appears to conform to roughly what we do study in biology, chemistry, and physics. But was this something that just George Osawa Michio Kushi jotted down in the coffee shop? Or is this more or less confirmed a reality? Okay, as a reality check, I'd like to look at a very traditional model of creation to see how this compares. And the one I'd like to use is the one in the Bible. And